In the still waters of Hong Kong's Victoria Harbour, on the 9th of January 1972, the world's largest ocean liner began to die. Not from a storm, not from an iceberg, not from the violence of war that she had survived without a scratch. From fire, multiple fires, igniting simultaneously across a ship docked in calm water, surrounded by help in broad daylight. The RMS Queen Elizabeth. 83,000 tons of steel and ambition. 1,031 feet of British prestige. She had cost over £20 million to build. She had carried the rich, the famous, and the powerful across the Atlantic for decades. She had survived a world war. But on that January morning, something went wrong. Or perhaps something went exactly as planned. Within 48 hours, she was on her side, gutted, gone. The investigation concluded arson, person or persons unknown. No confession, no arrest, no answer. This is the dark story of Britain's largest ocean liner, the RMS Queen Elizabeth. We're going to cover everything: her creation, her glory, the lives lived aboard her, the fortunes made and lost, the fire that shouldn't have happened, the evidence that disappeared, the theories that multiplied, and the question that remains 50 years later: was she murdered, or did she choose to burn? Join me as we go below deck into the luxury, the mystery, and the hours that were never explained. The RMS Queen Elizabeth was not merely large. She was, for 56 years, the largest passenger vessel ever constructed. 1,031 feet from stem to stern. 83,673 gross tons. 12 decks. A beam of 118 feet. Draft of 38 feet when fully loaded. She could carry 2,283 passengers and a crew of 1,001. Her 4 Parson steam turbines generated 200,000 horsepower. Her top speed, when pressed, exceeded 32 knots. She consumed 600 tons of fuel oil per day at cruising speed. Her water desalination plants produced 4,000 gallons of fresh water hourly. Her kitchens, spread across 3 decks, could serve 7,000 meals in a single day. These are not poetic numbers. They are the dimensions of ambition. Of an empire that, in 1938, when her keel was laid, still believed it owned the future. She was built in Scotland, at the John Brown and Company shipyard in Clydebank, where her sister ship, the Queen Mary, had been completed 3 years earlier. The plan was simple in concept, staggering in execution. 2 ships, the largest, fastest, most luxurious liners ever built. Operating in tandem, they would dominate the North Atlantic, reducing crossing times, capturing the wealthy and the famous, projecting British power across the ocean in an age when air travel was still a novelty for the very rich or the very reckless. The Queen Elizabeth was launched on the 27th of September, 1938. Queen Elizabeth herself, the Queen Consort, performed the christening. 70,000 spectators watched as the hull, painted in Cunard's red primer, slid into the River Clyde. The largest moving object ever created by human hands up to that moment. The newspapers called her a masterpiece. They called her unsinkable, though they should have learned by then not to use that word. But she was not yet finished. Fitting out a ship of that scale takes time. Months, years. And the world, in 1938, was running out of time. By the time the Queen Elizabeth was ready for trials in early 1940, Britain was at war. The Atlantic was full of U-boats. Passenger service was a fantasy. Cunard, in consultation with the Admiralty, made a decision. The Queen Elizabeth would not carry tourists. She would carry soldiers. On the 2nd of March, 1940, in absolute secrecy, the unfinished liner slipped out of the Clyde under cover of darkness. No fanfare, no press. Her destination was not announced. Most assumed she was heading to Southampton for final fitting out. Instead, she steamed at full speed across the Atlantic, alone and unescorted to New York. A gamble. If the Germans had known, if a single U-boat had been waiting, the largest liner in the world would have been the largest target. She made it. And for the next 6 years, she was not a luxury liner. She was a troop ship, painted gray, stripped of her finery, her grand ballrooms converted into dormitories, her dining salons into mess halls. She could carry 15,000 soldiers at a time, crammed into every available space, sleeping in shifts, breathing the same recycled air, enduring the same monotonous diet. She sailed to the Mediterranean, to the Indian Ocean, to the Pacific. She carried American GIs, Canadian infantry, Australian divisions. She ferried over 800,000 troops during the war. Winston Churchill called her and her sister ship the Queen Mary, the two vessels that shortened the war by a year. But the war ended, and the Queen Elizabeth, still painted gray, still smelling of diesel and sweat, and the 1,000 small indignities of military transport, had to be transformed back into what she was always meant to be: a floating palace. The refitting took over a year. Every surface was scrubbed, repainted, reupholstered. The troop bunks were torn out. The original designs, shelved in 1939, were retrieved, and slowly, meticulously, the ship's interiors were completed to the specifications drawn up before the war. What emerged in 1946 was not merely a ship. It was a statement. A deliberate, almost defiant assertion that elegance still mattered. That beauty, craftsmanship, and tradition could survive the brutality of modern war. The first-class accommodations occupied the upper decks, suites paneled in English oak, French walnut, and Canadian maple, walls covered in silk damask, carpets so thick you could lose a penny in the pile. Each suite had its own sitting room, bedroom, private bath with marble fixtures. The beds were full-size, a rarity at sea. The linens were Egyptian cotton, replaced daily. The furniture was bespoke, designed specifically for each room by teams of artisans who understood that a chair bolted to a floor must still be a chair worth sitting in. The public rooms were even more extravagant. The main lounge, located amidships on the promenade deck, was 2 stories high, finished in burr walnut and sycamore, with a domed ceiling painted to resemble a Renaissance sky. The smoking room, reserved for gentlemen, was panelled in Australian walnut with leather armchairs the colour of dried blood. The drawing room, for ladies, was pale green and ivory, with hand-painted murals depicting English gardens. There was a library with 10,000 volumes, a cinema seating 250, a swimming pool tiled in turquoise and gold, with underwater lighting that made the water glow at night. The grand dining room could seat 800 at a sitting. Its walls were lined with etched glass panels, each one depicting a different British cathedral. The ceiling was coffered, each panel inlaid with gold leaf. The tables were set with Wedgwood china, Waterford crystal, and silverware engraved with the Cunard crest. Dinner was served in 7 courses. Breakfast included kippers, deviled kidneys, and porridge served with demerara sugar and cream so thick it had to be spooned. This was not transportation. This was theatre. And the passengers were the audience and the performers both. The inaugural transatlantic voyage of the Queen Elizabeth, as a passenger liner, commenced on the 16th of October, 1946. Southampton to New York. 5 days. The ship was fully booked. First class filled with aristocrats, film stars, industrialists. Cabin class with professionals, academics, families returning to America after years abroad. Tourist class with students, immigrants, and those who simply wanted to say they had sailed on the largest ship in the world. Among the notable passengers on that first crossing were the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Noel Coward, Laurence Olivier. They dined together in the Veranda Grill, the ship's most exclusive restaurant, accessible only to those in the finest suites. The menu that night included oysters from Whitstable, consommé Celestine, poached turbot with sauce mousseline, roast pheasant with bread sauce, and a dessert trolley that reportedly made the Duchess weep with nostalgia. Life aboard the Queen Elizabeth in those early post-war years was an exercise in controlled decadence. Passengers dressed for dinner, men in black tie, women in gowns that cost more than most people earned in a year. There were orchestras in the ballroom every night, dancing until 2 in the morning. Deck games during the day. Shuffleboard. Quoits. Competitive napkin folding. The absurdity of the very rich pretending to be athletes. But beneath the surface, beneath the laughter and the champagne, and the carefully maintained illusion of effortless luxury, there was an infrastructure. A hidden world of labor that made the fantasy possible. The crew of 1001 worked in shifts around the clock. Stewards, stewardesses, chefs, scullery maids, engineers, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, painters, laundresses, valets, cabin boys, bellhops, bartenders, waiters, sommeliers, musicians, nurses, doctors, radio operators, navigators, quartermasters, able seamen, firemen, greasers, wipers, coal trimmers. Each one a cog in a machine so complex that if any single part failed, the entire operation could collapse. The engine rooms, buried deep in the hull, were a vision of industrial hell. Temperatures regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The noise was so loud that men communicated in hand signals. The turbines, spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute, generated vibrations that could be felt throughout the ship. The men who worked there, the Black Gang as they were called, were paid less than the stewards who served drinks on the sun deck. They rarely saw daylight during a crossing. They ate separately, slept in cramped quarters on the lowest decks, and when they died, which they did with some regularity from heat stroke, heart failure, or accidents involving high-pressure steam, they were rarely mentioned in the ship's official reports. The Queen Elizabeth, like all great liners, was a floating class system, a microcosm of the society that built her. The rich on top, in the light and air, the workers below, in the heat and noise, and in between, the vast invisible machinery that kept the whole thing moving forward. For 22 years, from 1946 to 1968, the Queen Elizabeth crossed the Atlantic. Southampton to New York to Southampton, over and over. Hundreds of crossings, thousands of passengers, millions of miles. She became a fixture, a reliable, almost mundane presence in an era that was rapidly changing around her. The 1950s were her golden age. The Atlantic crossing was still the only practical way to travel between Europe and America for most people. Air travel existed, but it was expensive, uncomfortable, and not yet entirely safe. The ocean liner was still the default, and the Queen Elizabeth was the finest of them all. But by the early 1960s, the tide had turned. Jet aircraft were faster, cheaper, and increasingly reliable. The Boeing 707 entered service in 1958. Transatlantic passenger flights became routine. By 1965, more people were crossing the Atlantic by air than by sea. The ocean liners, those great symbols of prestige and permanence, were becoming obsolete. Cunard tried to adapt. They reduced fares, offered cruises to the Caribbean in the off-season, marketed the crossing as a vacation in itself, rather than merely a means of getting from one place to another. But the economics were brutal. The Queen Elizabeth cost over £100,000 per week to operate. Fuel, crew wages, maintenance, port fees, insurance. She needed to be nearly full on every crossing just to break even. And increasingly, she was not. By 1968, Cunard had made a decision. The Queen Elizabeth would be retired. Sold. Her sister ship, the Queen Mary, had already been sold to the city of Long Beach, California, to serve as a floating hotel and museum. The Queen Elizabeth would need a new owner, a new purpose. Enter C.Y. Tung. Tung Chao-yung, known in the West as C.Y. Tung, was one of the wealthiest men in Hong Kong, a shipping magnate, owner of Orient Overseas Line. He had built his fortune by buying old ships, refurbishing them, and putting them back to work in markets where newer vessels could not compete. He was not sentimental, but he was ambitious. And when the opportunity arose to purchase the largest ocean liner in the world, he saw not a relic, but a possibility. His plan was audacious. He would convert the Queen Elizabeth into a floating university, a school at sea. Students would live aboard, taking classes as the ship sailed around the world, visiting ports, experiencing cultures, combining education with adventure. He would call it CY's University, a play on his initials. CYS, CY's. Subtle, in the way that billionaires are subtle. The purchase price was rumored to be around £3 million, a fraction of what the ship had cost to build. Tung also acquired the rights to the name, the fittings, the furnishings, everything. In September 1968, the Queen Elizabeth, now renamed CY's University, left Southampton for the last time. Destination: Hong Kong. The voyage took weeks. The ship, only partially crewed, sailed through the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, the Indian Ocean. She arrived in Hong Kong in January 1971, and there, in Victoria Harbour, she was moored alongside a pier in Kowloon. The work began. Converting a luxury liner into a floating university is not a simple task. Cabins had to be reconfigured into classrooms, dining rooms into lecture halls, the grand ballroom into an auditorium, electrical systems updated, plumbing reworked, sprinkler systems installed, or at least they were supposed to be installed. The work was behind schedule, and the ship during this process was a construction site. Welders, carpenters, electricians, scaffolding, paint cans, sawdust. A once pristine vessel, now cluttered with the debris of transformation. By early January 1972, the work was nearly complete. Sea trials were scheduled for mid-month. Tung was optimistic. The ship would sail again. Students would arrive. The vision would become reality. But on the morning of January 9th, 1972, something went wrong. The first alarm was raised at approximately 11:20 in the morning. Smoke, coming from a lower deck near one of the forward cargo holds. Workers in the area grabbed fire extinguishers. Standard procedure. Small fires during refitting are not uncommon. Sparks from welding torches, overheated electrical wiring, careless disposal of cigarettes. Usually they are contained quickly. This one was not. Within minutes, reports came in from other parts of the ship. Smoke in the engine room, flames in a midship cabin, fire in the aft lounge, multiple fires, separate locations, all erupting within moments of each other. That is not how accidents happen. The workers tried to fight the flames. Fire hoses were unreeled. Water was turned on. But the ship's fire suppression system, still incomplete, was not fully operational. Water pressure was inconsistent. Some hoses produced only a trickle. Others, nothing at all. The fires, fed by fresh paint, varnish, wooden scaffolding, and decades of accumulated furnishings, spread faster than the workers could move. By noon, the decision was made to evacuate. Orders were shouted in Cantonese, English, and a half-dozen other languages. Workers dropped their tools and ran. Up companionways, along corridors, out onto the deck and down gangways to the pier. Some hesitated, trying to save equipment, documents, personal belongings. They were shouted at, dragged, pushed toward the exits. The fire, by this point, was no longer a problem to be solved. It was a force, unstoppable. The Hong Kong Fire Services Department arrived within 15 minutes. Fireboats converged on the harbor. Engines screamed through the streets of Kowloon. By 12:30, the entire firefighting capacity of the city was focused on one target. The Queen Elizabeth, now fully engulfed, was producing smoke so thick and black that it blotted out the sun. The column rose thousands of feet into the air, visible from Macau, 40 miles away. The fireboats, powerful vessels equipped with pumps capable of throwing thousands of gallons of water per minute, surrounded the ship. They blasted the hull, the decks, the superstructure. Steam rose in clouds where the water met the flames. The heat was so intense that paint on the fireboats began to blister. Firefighters on deck, attempting to get closer, were driven back by waves of radiant heat that felt like standing in front of an open furnace. Inside the ship, the fire was consuming everything. The silk wall coverings in the staterooms, the velvet curtains in the lounges, the mahogany paneling in the smoking room, the carpets, the furniture, the books in the library, the paintings in the corridors. Decades of craftsmanship, of labor, of care, reduced to ash and smoke. And the water, the thousands of tons of water being poured onto the ship in an attempt to save her, was accumulating. Pooling in the lower decks, adding weight, destabilizing her. By evening, the Queen Elizabeth had begun to list, slowly at first, a degree or two, then more. The firefighters, still aboard, felt the deck tilting beneath their feet. Orders were given to withdraw. The last men scrambled off just as the list reached 10 degrees. Then 15. Then 20. At approximately 9 o'clock that night, the Queen Elizabeth, the largest ocean liner ever built, rolled onto her side and sank into the shallow waters of Victoria Harbor. She came to rest on the harbor floor. Her port side submerged, her starboard side and upper work still visible above the waterline. Smoke continued to pour from the wreck for another full day. No one had died. Not a single person. 500 workers and firefighters had been aboard at various points during the disaster. All of them had escaped. It was, in that sense, a miracle. But the ship was gone. And the questions, the dark, unanswerable questions, had only just begun. The silence after a disaster is a peculiar thing. The noise stops, the alarms, the shouting, the roar of flames and the hiss of water meeting fire. And what remains is an absence so profound that it feels like pressure in the ears. On the night of January 9th, 1972, and as the Queen Elizabeth settled onto her side in the dark waters of Victoria Harbor, that silence descended, broken only by the lap of water against her exposed hull and the quiet idling of fireboats maintaining their positions around the wreck. The men who had fought the fire stood on the pier, on the decks of tugboats, in the streets of Kowloon, and watched. Soot-stained, exhausted. Some were weeping, not from grief exactly, but from the peculiar helplessness that comes from witnessing the death of something too large to die. The Queen Elizabeth had survived a world war, had carried hundreds of thousands of souls across the most dangerous ocean on Earth, had outlasted empires and ideologies, and now she lay on her side in a harbor, killed not by violence or weather, but by fire. Fire that should not have happened, could not have happened, not like that, but it had. The evacuation, miraculous as it was, had not been without its moments of terror. The workers aboard the Queen Elizabeth that morning were not sailors. They were contractors, welders, electricians, carpenters, men hired to transform a ship, not to abandon one. Most had never been trained in maritime emergency procedures. They did not know the layout of the vessel, did not know where the fire exits were, which companionways led up and which led down into the belly of the ship where the smoke was thickest. One group of electricians, 5 men, had been working in a lower deck compartment when the alarms began. They made for the nearest stairwell, only to find it blocked by flames. The metal stairs were already hot to the touch. Smoke was pouring down from above. They retreated, tried another route, found it similarly impossible. For several minutes they were trapped, moving through corridors filling rapidly with black chemical smoke, shouting to each other in voices that grew hoarser with each breath. They found an external scaffold, one that had been erected along the hull for painting work. It was not designed for evacuation. It swayed under their weight. The metal was slick with condensation and soot, but they climbed down one by one, clinging to handrails and vertical supports until they reached a platform low enough for a harbor tug to pull alongside. The tug's crew hauled them aboard. One of the electricians, once safe, vomited seawater and bile onto the deck, though he had not been in the water. Just fear, manifesting. Elsewhere, a team of firefighters had boarded the ship early in the emergency, dragging hoses through the first-class corridors, trying to reach the source of one of the fires. The corridors, once lined with mirrors and polished wood, were unrecognizable. Smoke reduced visibility to inches. The heat was enough to melt the synthetic soles of their boots. They advanced slowly, feeling their way along walls, until a section of ceiling collapsed ahead of them. Not the metal deck above, but the decorative plaster and wooden framing that had been installed decades earlier to give the ship the appearance of a grand hotel. It came down in a shower of sparks and burning debris. The firefighters reversed course, dragging their hoses back the way they had come, abandoning the compartment to the flames. One firefighter, separated from his team in the confusion, found himself alone in what had once been the grand ballroom. The smoke was thinner here, the fire not yet arrived, and for a moment he could see the space. The domed ceiling, cracked and stained. The chandeliers, some still hanging, others shattered on the floor. The walls, stripped of their silk, but still bearing the faint outlines of the patterns that had once adorned them. He described it later as standing in a cathedral after the congregation has fled, beautiful and hollow, and waiting for the end. He made his way to an exterior door, emerged onto the promenade deck, and climbed down a rope ladder to a waiting fireboat. Behind him, flames began to lick through the ballroom's doorway. By the time he reached the water, the room was gone. C.Y. Tung arrived at the harbor within an hour of the first alarm. He stood on the pier, surrounded by his staff, by fire officials, by police, and watched his £3 million investment burn. Those who were present said he showed little emotion. He asked questions, precise, technical questions. How many fires? Where? What was the water pressure in the mains? Had the sprinkler system been activated? The answers when they came were not encouraging. Multiple fires, scattered locations, water pressure inadequate, sprinklers not yet fully installed. He reportedly nodded, asked if everyone was accounted for, was told yes, nodded again, then asked about insurance. It is easy, from a distance, to interpret this as callousness. But men like Tung do not build empires by indulging in sentiment. The ship was burning. Nothing he could do would stop it. The human cost was 0. That was the only number that mattered in the immediate term. Everything else was accounting. The insurance on the Seawise University was substantial. Estimates varied, but most sources placed it between 8 and 10 million US dollars. Far more than Tung had paid for the ship. The policies covered fire, of course, but they also included clauses about total loss, salvage, and liability. If the ship was a total loss, as it clearly was becoming, Tung stood to profit. Not a fortune by his standards, but enough to make the disaster financially bearable. This fact did not go unnoticed. Within hours, even as the fire still raged, whispers began. Insurance fraud. Deliberate sabotage. The timing, after all, was suspicious. The ship was nearly complete. Sea trials scheduled. But also, significantly, Tung had recently renegotiated some of his financing. There were debts, pressures. The conversion had run over budget. Perhaps the ship, as a functioning university, was worth less than the ship as a smoldering wreck with a valid insurance claim. Tung denied everything, publicly, firmly, But the rumors once started are impossible to extinguish. They burn differently than fires. Slower, hotter, and they leave different kinds of scars. The Hong Kong fire services fought the blaze for 2 full days. Shifts rotated. Fireboats withdrew to refuel and returned. The fire, despite the unimaginable volumes of water being poured into the ship, refused to die. It found pockets of fuel. Old mattresses stored in crew quarters, paint lockers, diesel tanks not yet drained. Each time the firefighters believed they had it contained, a new section would erupt. Part of the problem was the ship's design. The Queen Elizabeth had been built with fire safety in mind, but the standards of 1938 were not the standards of 1972. She had fire doors, yes, bulkheads that could be sealed, but she also had wood. Everywhere. Structural wood, decorative wood, veneers and panels and furniture. And during the conversion, much of her internal layout had been altered, walls removed, new partitions added. The careful compartmentalization that might have contained a fire in her original configuration no longer existed. The water they poured into her did as much harm as good. It pooled in the lower decks, thousands of tons of it, adding weight in all the wrong places. Ships float because they displace water, but when the water is inside the ship, the physics reverse. She was taking on weight, growing heavier, and as the fire weakened the structural supports, as steel beams softened in the heat and decks began to sag, the balance shifted. The list began around 6 in the evening on the 9th. Subtle at first. Observers on the pier noticed that the ship's funnel, previously vertical, was now tilted slightly. By 7, the tilt was pronounced. By 8, unmistakable. Fire officials made the call. Everyone off. The ship was going over. The last firefighters withdrew at approximately 8:45. They climbed down ladders, jumped to the decks of fireboats, watched from a safe distance as the Queen Elizabeth, groaning like a living thing, rolled further and further onto her side. At 9:03, she came to rest on the harbor bottom. The sound, witnesses said, was like thunder. A deep, resonant boom that echoed off the buildings lining the harbor. Then silence again. She lay there, half submerged, smoke still rising from her exposed flank, and the people of Hong Kong came to see. Thousands of them. Lining the waterfront, taking photographs, pointing. Children were lifted onto their parents' shoulders to get a better view. Vendors sold tea and dumplings. The disaster had become a spectacle. The official investigation began the next morning. The Hong Kong Fire Services Department took the lead, assisted by representatives from the Marine Department and the colonial government. Their task was straightforward in theory: determine the cause of the fire, prevent it from happening again. In practice, it was a nightmare. The ship was a wreck, partially submerged, gutted by fire, structurally unstable. Accessing the interior was dangerous. Divers went down, but visibility in the harbor water was poor. The ship had settled into the silt at an angle, and many of the lower compartments were completely flooded. The areas that were accessible had been so thoroughly destroyed by fire that identifying the point of origin was nearly impossible. Everything was charred, melted, collapsed. But the investigators had one advantage: witnesses, hundreds of them. Workers who had been aboard when the fire started, and their testimonies, when compiled, told a disturbing story. The fires had not started in one location. They had started in at least 5, possibly more, scattered across the ship, in compartments that had no connection to each other, no shared electrical systems, no common ventilation. The fires had ignited within minutes of each other. In some cases, simultaneously. This was not an accident. Accidents do not behave that way. Electrical fire spread from a single point. Welding sparks ignite nearby materials and burn outward. But multiple fires, in separate locations, starting at the same time, require coordination. They require intention. The investigators found evidence of accelerants, not everywhere, but in enough places to confirm suspicion. Traces of petroleum distillates in areas where no such chemicals should have been. Burn patterns consistent with liquid fuels. And, most damningly, signs that certain fire doors that should have been open to allow workers to move freely during the refit, had been deliberately jammed shut, preventing escape, ensuring the fire would spread. In March 1972, the inquiry released its findings. The fire aboard the Seawise University had been deliberately set. Arson. Person or persons unknown. The report stopped short of speculating on motive, but the conclusion was unavoidable. Someone had wanted the Queen Elizabeth to burn. The theories multiplied like rumors in a port town, each one plausible, none provable. The first theory, and the most obvious, was insurance fraud. Tung had the motive. The ship was expensive to convert, behind schedule, and uncertain to succeed as a floating university. The insurance payout would exceed his total investment. He had the access. His company controlled the ship, hired the workers, managed security. If someone wanted to arrange a fire, Tung's organization would have been able to do it. But there was no evidence, no confession, no whistleblower. And Tung himself seemed genuinely devastated. He pursued the insurance claim, yes, but he also spent years afterward trying to salvage parts of the ship, recover relics, preserve the memory. That does not sound like a man who destroyed his own dream for money. The second theory involved labor disputes. The conversion project employed hundreds of workers, many of them unionized. There had been disagreements over wages, working conditions, safety standards. Some of the unions had ties to leftist political organizations, groups sympathetic to the People's Republic of China. C.Y. Tung, by contrast, was a nationalist, a supporter of Taiwan, a capitalist in a city that was, at the time, a British colony, but increasingly influenced by Beijing. Could the fire have been a political act? A statement? Destroying a symbol of Western decadence and colonial wealth? Possibly. But again, no evidence. No group claimed responsibility. No arrests were made. The third theory was simpler. Personal grudge. Someone with access to the ship, someone who felt wronged or slighted, who decided to burn it down out of spite or revenge. A disgruntled worker, a spurned contractor, a gambler in debt who had been paid to start the fire by someone with an interest in seeing the ship destroyed. This theory had the advantage of being small, human scale. It did not require vast conspiracies or political intrigue. Just one person, one match, one moment of anger or desperation. But it also had the disadvantage of being untraceable. If the arsonist was a lone individual, and if they kept quiet, they would never be found. The fourth theory, whispered but never seriously investigated, involved rival shipping interests. The Seawise University, if successful, would have been a competitor. Not in the traditional shipping market, but in the emerging cruise and educational tourism sectors. Other companies had investments in that space. Perhaps one of them saw Tung's project as a threat. Perhaps they arranged for it to be eliminated. Corporate sabotage. It happens. Ships have been sunk for less. But proving it would require access to records, communications, financial transactions that were never made public. And in the absence of proof, it remained speculation. The fifth theory, rarely spoken aloud but present in the eyes of those who watched the ship burn, was simpler still. The Queen Elizabeth wanted to die. She had been built for a purpose: to carry passengers across the Atlantic in luxury and speed. She had done that. Then she had been a troop ship. She had done that too. But a floating university, a school at sea? That was not what she was. It was a humiliation, a grotesque repurposing of something that had once been magnificent. Perhaps the fire was not sabotage. Perhaps it was the ship herself, rejecting the indignity of her new role, choosing to burn rather than endure. This theory, of course, is nonsense. Ships do not choose. They do not want. They are steel and rivets and paint. But those who loved the Queen Elizabeth, and there were many, found it easier to believe in a romantic suicide than in the mundane cruelty of arson. The human stories from the disaster, few as they were given the absence of fatalities, carried a particular weight. The men who escaped the fire were not passengers. They were workers. Men whose names were not recorded in the ship's logs, whose presence aboard was a matter of employment, not choice. They did not have cabins. They had tool belts and thermoses of tea, and shifts that started before dawn. One of them, a welder named Chung, had been working on the Queen Elizabeth for 8 months. He had welded seams in the hull, repaired structural supports damaged during the ship's long voyage from England, reinforced bulkheads to meet updated safety codes. He knew the ship, could navigate her in the dark. When the fire started, he was in a lower compartment, far from any exit. He heard the alarms, smelled the smoke, and he did what workers do. He grabbed his tools and headed for the stairwell. Not to escape, not yet, but to see if he could help. By the time he reached the main deck, the fire was everywhere. He dropped his tools, joined the evacuation, made it to the pier. Later, he was interviewed by a local newspaper, asked how he felt. He said, "I built parts of that ship. Now those parts are gone. It feels like losing a piece of yourself." The paper printed the quote, 3 sentences, then moved on to the next story. Chung's name was spelled incorrectly. Another man, a ship's officer who had stayed on as part of Tung's skeleton crew during the conversion, described the moment he realized the ship was going to sink. He had been aboard ocean liners his entire career, understood their balance, their weight distribution, the physics that kept them upright. When the list began, he knew. He climbed to the highest accessible point, the boat deck, and stood there as the ship rolled beneath him. He did not jump, did not panic, just waited until the deck was steep enough that he could step off onto the hull, now horizontal, and walk across it to a waiting fireboat. He said later that it felt like walking on the grave of something that should have been immortal. A firefighter, one of the last off, told a story about finding a photograph in one of the cabins. A black and white picture in a broken frame, lying on the floor amid the ash. It showed a young couple on deck, smiling, the ocean behind them. Probably from the ship's early years, the 1950s. The photograph had survived the fire somehow. He picked it up, intending to save it. But then the floor shifted, the deck tilted, and he had to drop it and run. He said he still thinks about that photograph. Wonders who those people were. If they knew their picture would outlast them by decades, only to burn in a harbor on the other side of the world. These are the fragments. The small human moments that survive when the grand narratives collapse. They do not explain what happened. They do not solve the mystery, but they remind us that disasters, even those involving objects as large and impersonal as ocean liners, are ultimately about people, about the lives that intersect with steel and fire and water, about the things we build and the things we lose. The wreck of the Queen Elizabeth remained in Victoria Harbour for 2 years, a navigation hazard, an eyesore, a reminder. The colonial government demanded its removal. Tung, still embroiled in insurance disputes and legal wrangling, did what he could. Salvage crews were hired. Divers cut away sections of the superstructure. The funnels were removed. Parts of the upper decks were dismantled and sold for scrap. Slowly, laboriously, the visible portions of the ship were reduced. But the hull, the massive steel hull that had once been the largest moving object on Earth, could not be easily removed. It was embedded in the silt, weighed down by water and debris. Cutting it apart underwater was expensive, dangerous, and slow. Tung's finances were strained. The salvage operation stalled. And so the hull remained, half buried, rusting, a monument to ambition and failure. Then, in 1974, an opportunity arrived, not a solution, but a repurposing. The James Bond film, The Man with the Golden Gun, was in production, and the filmmakers needed a location, a villainous lair, somewhere exotic, unusual, visually striking. Someone suggested the wreck of the Queen Elizabeth, partially submerged, tilted at a dramatic angle, accessible by boat. Perfect. The production team arrived, dressed the wreck to look like a secret base, filmed their scenes, and for a brief moment, the Queen Elizabeth was famous again. Not as a liner, not as a university, but as a prop, a backdrop for espionage and explosions. The indignity was almost poetic. After filming wrapped, the salvage work resumed. By 1975, most of the remaining structure had been cut away. The scraps were sold. The rest was buried. Victoria Harbour was being expanded, land reclaimed from the sea, and the remnants of the Queen Elizabeth were simply covered over, filled in, paved. Today, somewhere beneath the streets and buildings of Kowloon, pieces of her still exist, invisible, forgotten, pressed into the earth like fossils. The insurance claim, as expected, became a battlefield. Tung filed for a total loss, $8 million. The insurers, a syndicate of Lloyd's of London underwriters, and several Asian firms resisted, not because they disputed that the ship was destroyed. That much was obvious, but because the cause of destruction mattered. If the fire was accidental, the policy paid. If it was arson, and if Tung or his associates had any involvement, however indirect, the policy was void. The legal proceedings dragged on for years. Depositions were taken. Witnesses were interviewed and re-interviewed. Financial records were subpoenaed. Tung's business dealings were examined in microscopic detail. Every contract he had signed, every worker he had hired, every payment made during the conversion. The insurers were looking for a connection, a thread that would tie Tung to the arson and absolve them of paying. They found nothing conclusive. Tung's finances, while complex, showed no obvious signs of desperation. He was wealthy. Not liquid, perhaps, but wealthy. The conversion was expensive, yes, but it was funded through a combination of loans, private investment, and Tung's own capital. He stood to gain from the insurance, certainly, but he also stood to gain more from a successful floating university. The tuition fees alone, projected over a decade of operation, would have exceeded the insurance payout many times over. The investigators hired by the insurers interviewed workers, asked if anyone had seemed suspicious, if anyone had been seen in areas they should not have been, if anyone had exhibited unusual behavior in the days before the fire. The answers were maddeningly vague. It was a construction site. Hundreds of men coming and going. Some hired directly, others subcontracted by subcontractors. The chain of employment was so convoluted that identifying every individual who had access to the ship was impossible. One worker mentioned seeing a man he did not recognize in a lower corridor 2 days before the fire, carrying a toolbox, moving quickly, but he could not describe the man's face, could not say whether he was Chinese, European, Southeast Asian. Just a man. With a toolbox, on a ship full of men with toolboxes. Another worker reported finding a door that had been wedged shut with a piece of metal. Unusual, he said, but not alarming. Doors jammed all the time during construction. He had removed the wedge, opened the door, and thought nothing more of it. Only later, after the fire, did he wonder if it had been deliberate. But by then, the door was ash, and the wedge was lost, and his memory was suspect. The insurers pushed harder. suggested that perhaps Tung had not ordered the arson himself, but had created conditions that made it possible, had hired unreliable contractors, had failed to implement adequate security, had, through negligence if not intent, allowed someone to destroy the ship. Therefore, the claim should be reduced. Partially paid, perhaps, but not in full. Tung's lawyers pushed back, argued that the arson, whoever committed it, was a criminal act, that Tung was a victim, not a perpetrator, that the insurance was designed precisely for this scenario. Unpredictable, malicious destruction of property. The policy did not require Tung to prove his innocence. It required the insurers to prove his guilt. In the end, a settlement was reached. The details were not made public, but estimates suggest Tung received somewhere between $4 and $6 million. Less than the full claim, but enough to cover his losses and walk away. The insurers, for their part, avoided a lengthy trial and the risk of a judgment that might have forced them to pay the entire sum. It was an unsatisfying conclusion. No one was vindicated. No one was punished. The fire remained a crime without a criminal, and the Queen Elizabeth, or what was left of her, remained a mystery without a solution. In the decades since the fire, theories have continued to evolve. New information has surfaced, though none of it definitive. Former workers have come forward with stories, some credible, some less so. Journalists have investigated. Authors have written books. Documentaries have been produced, each one attempting to answer the question that has lingered for over 50 years. Who burned the Queen Elizabeth, and why? One theory that gained traction in the 1980s involved Taiwanese intelligence. The suggestion was that Tung, a known supporter of the nationalist government in Taiwan, had been using his shipping company to transport materials, possibly weapons, to anti-communist forces in Southeast Asia. The floating university was a cover. The conversion was never meant to be completed. The ship was a warehouse, a staging point, and when the operation was compromised or no longer needed, it was destroyed to eliminate evidence. This theory has a certain appeal. It involves espionage, international intrigue, Cold War politics. It explains the multiple ignition points, the apparent coordination, the lack of any clear perpetrator, but it also lacks evidence. No documents have emerged, no former agents have confessed, and Tung himself, who died in 1982, never hinted at any such involvement. It remains at best speculation. Another theory, more recent, involves organized crime. The Triads. Hong Kong in the early 1970s was a city where criminal syndicates exercised significant power. They controlled labor unions, shipping, construction. It is plausible, some argue, that Tung refused to pay protection money, or that he offended a rival, or that the conversion project interfered with some other criminal enterprise. Something happening in the harbor that required the Queen Elizabeth not to be there. So the Triads burned her. Again, no proof. But also, no definitive refutation. The Triads do not keep records. They do not issue press releases. If they were involved, the truth died with the men who carried it out. And those men, if they existed, would be in their 80s or 90s now. If they are alive at all. A third theory, darker and more personal, suggests that the arson was an act of nihilism. That someone, perhaps a worker who had spent months laboring on the conversion, looked at the ship and saw not a future university, but a monument to futility. The Queen Elizabeth had been the largest, the fastest, the most beautiful. And now she was being turned into a classroom, a dormitory, a shadow of what she once was. Perhaps someone decided that if she could not be what she was meant to be, she should not be at all. A mercy killing, in a sense. Destruction as preservation of memory. This theory is impossible to prove or disprove. It rests on psychology, not evidence, on the idea that someone might love a ship enough to kill it. But those who have spent their lives around ships, who have worked on them, sailed on them, devoted careers to their preservation, will tell you that such feelings are not uncommon. Ships inspire loyalty, affection, and sometimes, when a beloved vessel is degraded or misused, those emotions can curdle into something darker. The legacy of the Queen Elizabeth is complicated. She was, for a time, the pinnacle of ocean liner design. The largest passenger ship in the world. A symbol of British engineering and ambition. But her career was defined as much by what she was not as by what she was. She was not a commercial success. The Queen Mary, her sister ship, was always more popular, more profitable, more beloved. The Queen Elizabeth was larger, yes, but she lacked the Mary's charm, her reputation. Passengers spoke of the Mary with affection. The Elizabeth they spoke of with respect. There is a difference. Her wartime service was exemplary. She carried more troops than any other vessel, steamed more miles, survived more danger. But she was painted gray, stripped of her finery, treated as a tool rather than a treasure. And when the war ended, when she was finally allowed to become what she had been designed to be, a luxury liner, the world had changed. The Atlantic crossing was no longer the journey of a lifetime. It was an inconvenience, something to be endured, not enjoyed. Jets were faster, cheaper. The future belonged to the air, not the sea. So the Queen Elizabeth spent 2 decades crossing the Atlantic, necessary but not celebrated. She made money for Cunard, but not enough. She attracted passengers, but not the right kind. The wealthy and famous increasingly flew. The ship carried those who could not afford air travel, or who had reasons to avoid it. Immigrants, refugees, students, families, decent people, all of them, but not the clientele the ship had been designed for. She was a Rolls-Royce being used as a taxi, and then retirement, sail. The humiliation of being repurposed. The Queen Mary became a hotel, which at least allowed her to retain some dignity. She was still a ship, still recognizable, still visited by people who wanted to experience, however artificially, the romance of ocean travel. But the Queen Elizabeth was to become a school. Her grand ballrooms turned into lecture halls, her staterooms into dormitories. It was not preservation. It was transformation. Erasure. The fire, in a perverse way, saved her from that fate. She did not become a floating university. She did not spend years ferrying students around the Pacific, her decks crowded with backpacks and bicycles, her dining rooms serving cafeteria food. She burned. She sank. She died, if ships can die, on her own terms. Destroyed rather than diminished. There is a memorial of sorts. In California, outside the offices of what was once Tung's shipping company, there stands an anchor. One of the Queen Elizabeth's anchors, salvaged from the wreck. It weighs 16 tons. Next to it are 2 large bronze letters, Q and E, recovered from the bow. They are green with patina now, weathered and stained, but still recognizable, still bearing the name of the ship they once adorned. Visitors occasionally stop, take photographs, run their hands over the metal. Most do not know the full story. They know the ship was famous, that it burned, that it no longer exists. The details, the mysteries, the unanswered questions, those are forgotten. Or perhaps they were never widely known. Disasters fade. The specifics blur. What remains is a vague sense of tragedy, a name half remembered, a photograph in a book somewhere. But for those who do know the story, the anchor and the letters are insufficient. They are fragments, relics. They tell you the ship existed, but not what it meant. Not what it felt like to stand on her deck as she cut through the Atlantic at 30 knots, spray flying, engines thrumming, the horizon endless. Not what it felt like to see her burning in a harbor, helpless, dying slowly over 2 days while the world watched. The fire also raised questions about ship safety, though the answers were slow in coming. The Queen Elizabeth, at the time of her destruction, was not in service. She was not carrying passengers. She was not subject to the same regulations that governed active vessels. This created a loophole. Ships under conversion, ships being refitted, ships in dry dock, these were often exempt from fire safety requirements. The assumption was that they were inert, stationary, attended by workers who knew what they were doing. The Queen Elizabeth proved that assumption wrong. A ship under conversion is, in many ways, more vulnerable than a ship at sea. The fire suppression systems are offline. The crew is minimal. The layout is disrupted by construction. Materials are stored haphazardly. Welding torches, paint thinners, sawdust, all the detritus of renovation, create fuel for fires. And if a fire starts, if it spreads, there is no way to outrun it. The ship cannot leave. It sits there and burns. After the Queen Elizabeth, there were discussions. Maritime safety organizations reviewed their standards. Some jurisdictions implemented new rules. Ships under major refit were required to maintain active firefighting systems, sprinklers, hoses, alarms. Fire watches were mandated. Workers were trained in evacuation procedures. Security was tightened to prevent sabotage. But these changes were not universal, and they were not retroactive. Ships already under conversion, already sitting in harbors around the world in various states of disrepair, were grandfathered in. The new rules applied to future projects, not current ones, so the risk remained. And over the years, other ships burned. Not as famously, perhaps, but with the same underlying causes. Fire, negligence, sabotage. The pattern repeated. The lesson of the Queen Elizabeth, if there was one, was this. Size does not confer safety. History does not confer immunity. A ship, no matter how grand, no matter how storied, is vulnerable. It is steel and wood and paint. It floats because of physics, not because of destiny. And when fire finds it, when the conditions are right, it burns like anything else. There is a photograph taken on the afternoon of January 10th, 1972, the day after the fire. The Queen Elizabeth lies on her side in Victoria Harbour, smoke still rising from her hull. In the foreground, a small sampan, a traditional Chinese fishing boat, is crossing the harbour. The sampan is perhaps 12 feet long. A single fisherman stands at the stern, poling the boat through the water. He is not looking at the ship. He is focused on his work, oblivious or indifferent to the wreck behind him. The contrast is striking. The sampan, tiny and fragile, going about its business. The Queen Elizabeth, 1,000 feet of burning steel, brought low. The photograph was published in several newspapers at the time. It became iconic in a minor way. A symbol of the indifference of the world to individual tragedy. Life goes on. The fisherman still needs to fish. The harbor still needs to function. The ship is spectacular in its dying, but it is also already irrelevant. That photograph captures something essential about the Queen Elizabeth's end. It was dramatic, yes. Shocking. Mysterious. But it was also, in the grand scheme of things, inconsequential. No one died. No other ships were damaged. The harbor was disrupted for a few days, then returned to normal. The world did not stop. The fishermen did not stop. Only the ship stopped. And even then, only temporarily. Within 2 years, she was gone. Scrapped, buried, erased. The mystery of who burned her and why remains. But perhaps the more interesting question is why we care. Why does the destruction of a ship, even a famous one, even under suspicious circumstances, command our attention decades later? There are unsolved crimes everywhere. Murders, thefts, frauds. Most of them are forgotten within years. But the Queen Elizabeth lingers. The story is retold. The theories are revisited. Maybe it is because ships are different. They are not just objects. They are places. Worlds unto themselves. The Queen Elizabeth was a city. She had streets and rooms and public spaces. People lived on her, worked on her, traveled on her. She had a history, memories. She was, in a sense, alive. And when she burned, it was not the destruction of property. It was the death of a place, a world ending. That kind of loss resonates differently. Or maybe it is simpler. Maybe we care because the mystery is insoluble. Because no matter how much we investigate, no matter how many theories we construct, we will never know for certain what happened. And there is something appealing about that. About a question that cannot be answered. It allows us to speculate endlessly, to argue, to imagine. The Queen Elizabeth, in her destruction, became immortal in a way she never was in service. She became a story, and stories, unlike ships, do not sink. In Hong Kong, there are still people who remember the fire. Older residents who were children at the time. They recall being taken to the waterfront by their parents to see the smoke. The smell of burning paint and oil that hung over the city for days. The way the harbor was filled with boats, all of them watching, none of them able to help. They remember the wreck lying there for years, slowly being dismantled, slowly disappearing. And then, finally, being buried. Some of them also remember the conspiracy theories, the whispered conversations in tea houses and markets, the speculation about who had done it and why. The theories involved everyone, the communists, the nationalists, the British, the triads, Tung himself, foreign agents, disgruntled workers, jealous rivals. The theories were contradictory, mutually exclusive, but they coexisted because no one knew. And in the absence of knowledge, every explanation was possible. One elderly man, interviewed in the late 1990s, said something that stayed with the interviewer. He said, "The fire was not the tragedy. The tragedy was that no one cared enough to find out the truth. The ship burned. People shrugged, moved on. That is Hong Kong. Always looking forward, never looking back. There is truth in that. Hong Kong in 1972 was a city in transition. The colonial era was winding down, though it would be another 25 years before the handover to China. The economy was booming. Skyscrapers were rising. The harbor was being expanded. The past, represented by things like old ocean liners, was an inconvenience, something to be cleared away to make room for the future. The Queen Elizabeth, in that context, was already obsolete before she burned. She was a relic of an earlier age, an age of empires and ocean crossings and slow, stately travel. That age was over. Jets had won. The future was fast, efficient, disposable. There was no room for ships that took 5 days to cross the Atlantic. No room for grand ballrooms and 7-course dinners and promenades where passengers strolled in evening dress. So, when the ship burned, the city mourned briefly, then moved on. The wreck was removed. The site was redeveloped. And the Queen Elizabeth became a footnote. A trivia question. A name that most people recognize, but few can place. But the fire, and the mystery surrounding it, refused to disappear entirely. It lingered in the margins, in maritime history books, in documentary films, in online forums where enthusiasts debate the evidence and propose new theories. The ship may be gone, but the question remains. Who burned the Queen Elizabeth? And until that question is answered, if it ever is, the story will continue. The ghost of the great liner, still burning, still sinking, still defying explanation. The men who fought the fire carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Not the burns, though some had those. Not the smoke inhalation, though their lungs bore the scars. But the memory. The peculiar weight of having stood on the deck of the world's largest ocean liner as she burned beneath their feet, and knowing, even as they poured water onto the flames, that they were losing. One firefighter, a man named Lau, spoke about it years later in an interview that was never widely circulated. He described the heat, not just the temperature, which was extreme, but the quality of it, the way it seemed to radiate from inside the ship, as if the vessel herself had become a furnace. He said that standing on the deck, even on the windward side where the smoke was thinner, felt like standing too close to the sun. The air itself seemed to burn. But what stayed with him, what haunted him, was the sound. Ships, even when stationary, are never silent. They creak. They groan. Metal expands and contracts with the temperature. Water laps against the hull. But the Queen Elizabeth, as she burned, made sounds he had never heard before. Screaming sounds. Metal under stress. Warping, tearing. Glass shattering deep inside the superstructure. And underneath it all, a low resonant hum, like the note of a massive bell struck too hard. He said it sounded like the ship was in pain. Lau worked aboard the Queen Elizabeth for 6 hours on that first day, moving from deck to deck, dragging hoses, directing water at fires that seemed to erupt faster than they could be extinguished. At one point, he and his team were ordered into the first-class dining room. The fire had not yet reached it, but smoke was pouring through the ventilation system. They were told to soak everything, prevent the fire from spreading. The room, even filled with smoke, was extraordinary. The tables were still set, he said. Not with food, but with the remnants of the ship's former life. China plates stacked in corners. Crystal glasses wrapped in cloth. Silverware in wooden crates. The conversion had stripped the room of its grandeur, but traces remained. The coffered ceiling, blackened by smoke. The etched glass panels, some cracked, some intact. The sense of space, of scale, of a room designed to impress. They hosed down the tables, the walls, the ceiling, turned the dining room into a dripping, sodden cavern. And then the fire arrived anyway. Not through the doors, which they had sealed, but from below. It burned through the deck. Came up through the floor like something alive, something hungry. They retreated, sealed the doors behind them, left the dining room to burn. Lau said he still dreams about it sometimes. The last glimpse he had of that room, the flames licking up through the floorboards, the water they had poured running in streams toward the fire, as if feeding it. The broader narrative of the fire, the one told in newspapers and documentaries, focuses on the dramatic elements, the flames, the capsizing, the mystery. But there is another narrative, quieter and less cinematic, about the practicalities of fighting a shipboard fire in a crowded harbor. The fireboats, for instance. Hong Kong's fire service had 3 major fireboats in operation in January 1972. The Alexander Grantham, the Elite, the Fireboat No. 7. Each one capable of pumping thousands of gallons of seawater per minute through high-pressure nozzles. They were, in theory, designed for exactly this scenario. A ship fire in the harbor. But the Queen Elizabeth exceeded every parameter they had planned for. The ship was too large. The fireboats could only access certain sides. The berth where she was moored limited maneuverability. And the fire, distributed across the entire length of the vessel, meant that even with all 3 fireboats working simultaneously, they could only address a fraction of it at any given time. It was like trying to extinguish a city block with garden hoses. The coordination required was immense. Each fireboat had a captain, a crew, and a liaison officer in radio contact with the central fire command post on shore. Instructions were relayed. Positions were adjusted. But the smoke made visibility poor. The heat made close approach dangerous. And the constantly shifting situation, fires erupting in new locations, structural collapses, exploding fuel tanks, meant that plans became obsolete within minutes of being implemented. At one point, the Alexander Grantham was positioned off the stern, directing water at what appeared to be the largest concentration of flames. But the angle was wrong. Most of the water was hitting the hull, running off, wasted. The captain maneuvered closer, trying to get a better trajectory. Too close. The radiant heat began to blister the paint on the fireboat's superstructure. Alarms sounded. The boat had to reverse, retreat, reposition. Time lost. Water wasted. Fire spreading. There were discussions in those first hours about scuttling the Queen Elizabeth deliberately, opening seacocks, flooding her compartments in a controlled manner, sinking her quickly before the fire could spread further. The theory was that submerging the ship would starve the fire of oxygen, extinguish it, but the practicalities were insurmountable. The seacocks, designed to be operated from inside the ship, were inaccessible. The interior was already an inferno. No one could reach them. And even if they could, flooding a ship of that size in a controlled manner required precise calculations, careful sequencing. Do it wrong, and the ship could capsize unpredictably, potentially damaging the pier, nearby vessels, even the fireboats themselves. So the idea was abandoned, and the fire continued. C.Y. Tung watched from the pier for most of the first day. He did not pace, did not shout. Stood, mostly, with his hands in his pockets, surrounded by assistants who spoke to him quietly, updating him on developments. Occasionally, he would ask a question. Direct someone to contact a specific person, a salvage expert, an insurance adjuster, a government official. But for the most part, he was silent. There is a photograph of him from that day, standing near a pile of equipment, salvaged items that workers had managed to remove from the ship before the evacuation. Behind him, the Queen Elizabeth burns. Smoke billows. Flames are visible through portholes. Tung is in the foreground, in focus, wearing a dark suit. His expression is unreadable. Not grief, not anger. Something more complex. Resignation, perhaps. Or calculation. One of his assistants later described Tung's demeanor that day as professional. He was witnessing the destruction of a significant investment, a cherished project, but he did not allow emotion to interfere with logistics. He made decisions, authorized expenditures, coordinated with authorities, ensured that every possible resource was deployed, not because he believed the ship could be saved, but because that was what one did. You fought. Even when the outcome was certain, you fought. But privately, the assistant said, Tung was devastated. Not financially. He would recover from the financial loss. But emotionally, the floating university had been more than a business venture. It had been a vision, a way to combine education, travel, and cultural exchange. A legacy project. Something that would outlive him. And now, in a single day, it was gone. Tung lived another 10 years after the fire. He continued to run his shipping company, expand his business interests, involve himself in philanthropy and politics. But those who knew him said he was never quite the same. The fire had taken something from him. Not hope exactly, but a certain confidence in the future. An optimism. He had believed that grand projects were possible, that vision and capital and effort could overcome obstacles. The Queen Elizabeth taught him otherwise. He died in 1982, 57 years old, heart failure. At his funeral, someone placed a small model of the Queen Elizabeth on his casket. Not the wreck. The ship as she had been in her prime. Sleek, powerful, beautiful. It sailed with him into the fire. The legal aftermath of the disaster extended far beyond the insurance claim. There were inquiries into safety standards, into the adequacy of fire response, into the responsibilities of ship owners and contractors. The Hong Kong government, sensitive to criticism that it had not done enough to prevent the fire or to respond effectively, commissioned a detailed report. The report, published in late 1972, ran to over 300 pages. It included diagrams of the ship's layout, timelines of the fire's progression, analysis of the firefighting response, interviews with witnesses, and recommendations for future policy. Much of it was technical. dry. But buried within the bureaucratic language were fragments of human drama. One section detailed the experiences of workers trapped briefly in a lower compartment. How they had banged on the hull, hoping someone outside would hear. How a passing tugboat had, by chance, heard the banging, alerted authorities, and guided rescuers to their location. How they had been extracted through a porthole, one by one, pulled out onto the deck of the tug. How close they had come to being forgotten. Another section discussed the failure of communication systems. The ship's internal alarms had functioned, but the public address system, which should have allowed announcements to be broadcast throughout the vessel, was inoperative. Workers in some sections had not known there was a fire until they saw smoke. The delay, measured in minutes, had complicated evacuation and firefighting efforts. The report recommended that all ships under major refit maintain functional emergency communication systems. A simple recommendation. Obvious in hindsight, but it had not been policy before. The report also addressed the question of arson. Carefully. It noted the findings of the fire investigation, the evidence of multiple ignition points, the presence of accelerants, but it stopped short of assigning blame or speculating on motive. That was not the report's mandate. Its purpose was to assess the response, not to solve the crime. Still, the fact that arson was mentioned, prominently and repeatedly, ensured that the mystery remained part of the official record. The recommendations in the report were comprehensive. Improved fire safety standards for ships under conversion, mandatory security measures to prevent sabotage, enhanced firefighting capabilities in the harbor, regular drills and training for workers on ships undergoing refit. Most of the recommendations were implemented, at least in Hong Kong. Whether they prevented future disasters is unknowable. But the Queen Elizabeth, in her death, contributed to a marginal increase in safety. A small legacy perhaps, but a real one. For the families of the workers who were aboard the Queen Elizabeth that day, the fire was a near miss, a story of luck and survival. But it was also a reminder of vulnerability. These men worked in dangerous environments, shipyards, construction sites, places where accidents were common, and safety standards were often inadequate. The fact that no one died on the Queen Elizabeth was remarkable. Unusual, a statistical anomaly. One worker, a carpenter named Wong, went home that night and told his wife he was quitting. He had been aboard when the fire started, had evacuated with the others, had stood on the pier and watched the ship burn. And he had decided that no amount of money was worth that kind of risk. His wife, pragmatic, asked what he would do instead. He did not have an answer, but he did not go back. He found work elsewhere, in a furniture shop, making cabinets. Safer, duller. He lived another 40 years, died peacefully in his sleep, never regretted the decision. Another worker, younger, saw the fire differently. He had been thrilled by it, not by the destruction, but by the drama, the scale, the intensity. He stayed in the shipbuilding industry, worked on vessels all over Asia, and told the story of the Queen Elizabeth for the rest of his career. It became his signature tale. The time he escaped the burning liner. He embellished it over the years, added details that may or may not have been true, made himself more heroic, the danger more acute. But the core of the story remained. He had been there. He had survived. And that gave him a kind of status, a credibility, that transcended his actual role. These divergent reactions, flight and embrace, are typical of trauma. Some people retreat, some lean in. Neither response is wrong. Both are attempts to process an experience that defies easy categorization. The fire on the Queen Elizabeth was not a natural disaster. It was not an accident, or at least, probably not. It was violence, deliberate, coordinated, malicious. And the men who survived it had to find ways to live with that knowledge. The wreck itself, during the 2 years it remained visible, became a strange kind of tourist attraction. Not officially. The government did not promote it. But people came anyway. Locals. Visitors. They lined the waterfront, took photographs, pointed. The capsized hull, half submerged and rusting, was visually arresting. Morbid, yes, but also fascinating. A monument to failure. A cautionary tale in steel. Some people brought their children, explained what had happened, told simplified versions of the story. That was the biggest ship in the world. It burned. Now it's sunk. The children stared, tried to comprehend the scale, mostly failed. It was too large, too abstract. A ship that size does not fit easily into a child's understanding of the world. Photographers, professional and amateur, captured the wreck from every angle. At dawn, when the light was soft and golden. At dusk, when the water turned red. At night, when the wreck was a dark silhouette against the harbor lights. Some of these photographs are beautiful, in a bleak way. They show the contrast between the organic curves of the hull and the geometric skyline of Hong Kong rising behind it. Between the past, represented by the wreck, and the future, represented by the construction cranes dotting the city. One photograph, taken in late 1972, shows a group of children playing on a small beach near the wreck. They are building sandcastles, laughing, oblivious to the rusting hulk a few hundred yards offshore. The juxtaposition is jarring. Innocence and decay, life and death. The photograph was never widely published, but it survives in archives. A small, strange document of a moment when the disaster was still fresh, but already fading into the background of daily life. The final removal of the Queen Elizabeth's remains was not a single event, but a gradual process. Salvage crews worked for months, cutting away sections of the superstructure, hauling scrap metal to shore. The work was dangerous. The wreck was unstable. Shifting tides and currents moved it slightly, unpredictably. Workers had to board carefully, secure themselves with ropes, use cutting torches in confined spaces filled with rust and seawater. There were injuries. One worker fell, broke his leg. Another was burned when a cutting torch ignited residual oil trapped in a compartment. But there were no fatalities. The Queen Elizabeth, even in death, even in pieces, did not claim any lives. The scrap metal was sold. Most of it went to mills in Japan and South Korea, where it was melted down and repurposed, transformed into rebar, into steel beams, into components for cars and appliances and new ships. The atoms that once formed the largest ocean liner in the world were dispersed across Asia, incorporated into 1,000 mundane objects, anonymized, erased. By 1975, the visible portions of the wreck were gone. What remained, the lower hull and keel sections, were buried under landfill as Victoria Harbour was expanded. Tons of earth and rock and construction debris were dumped over the site, compacted, leveled, and then, eventually, paved. Today, that area is part of Kowloon. There are buildings there, roads, shops. Thousands of people walk over the remains of the Queen Elizabeth every day without knowing it. The ship is quite literally beneath their feet, entombed in earth, a secret foundation for a city that has forgotten she ever existed. There is no marker, no plaque, no indication that the largest ocean liner ever built lies buried there. And perhaps that is appropriate. The Queen Elizabeth was never meant to rest in Hong Kong. She was meant to cross oceans, to carry passengers between continents, to exist in motion, not in stillness. Her presence in that harbor, her death in that harbor, was an accident of history, an aberration, and the city, in burying her, was simply correcting the error. In the decades since, the Queen Elizabeth has appeared sporadically in popular culture, mostly in documentaries and books about ocean liners, about maritime disasters, about unsolved mysteries. She is a supporting character in these narratives. Not the star, but present. A cautionary tale. a footnote to the larger story of the decline of ocean travel. But there is one notable exception: the James Bond film, The Man with the Golden Gun. In that movie, the wreck of the Queen Elizabeth serves as the secret headquarters of the villain, Francisco Scaramanga. The production designers dressed the tilted, half-submerged hull to look like a lair, added furnishings, equipment, props, filmed scenes of Roger Moore as Bond infiltrating the ship, engaging in combat, narrowly escaping. The scenes are brief, perhaps 5 minutes of screen time, but they are memorable. The wreck, even as a set, even dressed and lit for dramatic effect, retains a haunting quality. The sense of scale, the wrongness of seeing a ship on its side, the juxtaposition of luxury, even ruined luxury, with violence and espionage. For many people, particularly those too young to remember the actual fire, the James Bond film is their only exposure to the Queen Elizabeth. They do not know her history, do not know she was once the largest liner in the world. They see the wreck, think it looks cool, move on. The ship, in this context, is reduced to a backdrop, a piece of scenery, which is, in its way, the final indignity. But for those who do know the history, the film is strange, uncomfortable. It feels wrong to see the Queen Elizabeth used that way, exploited for entertainment, reduced to a prop. And yet, there is also something fitting about it. The ship, in her final years, was always being repurposed. Troopship, liner, floating university. Why not film set? She was adaptable in life. Why not in death? The question of who burned the Queen Elizabeth has never been answered. After 50 years, it seems unlikely that it ever will be. The people involved, whether perpetrators, witnesses, or investigators, are mostly dead. The evidence, such as it was, is long gone. The ship herself, the primary crime scene, was dismantled and buried. What remains are theories, speculation, stories that may or may not be true, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the value of the Queen Elizabeth, at this point, is not in answers but in questions. In the reminder that even in the modern world, even in a crowded harbor in broad daylight, mysteries can occur. Things can happen that defy explanation. Ships can burn for reasons unknown. There is a comfort in that, strange as it may sound. In an age where everything is recorded, tracked, analyzed, the existence of an unsolved mystery is almost refreshing. It suggests that the world is still larger than our ability to comprehend it, that some things escape the net of surveillance and investigation, that uncertainty, ambiguity, the unknown still have a place. The Queen Elizabeth, in burning, in sinking, in refusing to yield her secrets, achieved a kind of immortality. She is remembered not for her service, which was competent but unremarkable, but for her death, for the drama of it, the mystery, the unanswered questions. She was the largest ocean liner ever built. For 56 years, no one surpassed her. And when she finally left the stage, she did so in flames, spectacularly, suspiciously, unforgettably. There are worse legacies. The men who fought the fire are old now, those who survive. They do not talk about it often. But when they do, they speak of the heat, the sound, the sense of helplessness, and the strange, persistent feeling that the ship did not want to be saved, that she chose to burn, that somewhere, in the chaos and the smoke and the flames, the Queen Elizabeth made a decision. Ships do not choose. We know this. They are steel, machines. But those who have spent their lives around ships, who have worked on them and loved them and watched them die, will tell you that ships have personalities, wills, destinies. And the Queen Elizabeth's destiny, perhaps, was always to burn, to refuse the indignity of a second life, to go out in fire and mystery rather than fade into obscurity. It is a romantic notion, irrational, unprovable, but it is also, in its way, true. Because the Queen Elizabeth, in dying as she did, became more than a ship. She became a story. And stories, unlike ships, do not sink. They float. They endure. They outlast steel and fire and time. Somewhere beneath the streets of Kowloon, under concrete and earth and the weight of a city, the remains of the Queen Elizabeth still rest, silent, forgotten by most, but still there, still waiting. And on quiet nights, if you stand in the right place and listen carefully, you might almost hear her,